Here we go. All right, so I take it that is my cue to get things kicked off. Sounds great. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Y'all can see my wonderful desktop. There we go. Go to PowerPoint. All right, now that we have, should be all of that taken care of. Bonjour, Deondre Smiles and Disney-Cause. Oasis and Dudem. My name is Deondre Smiles. I am of the Bullhead clan. As Jamie introduced me, I am a proud citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I am a President's Postdoctoral Scholar at The Ohio State University in the Departments of History and Geography. What that means is that I liked school so much that I did 10 years of it, did a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD, and then decided that I wanted to do some more school before I got myself out there in the job market. I kid, but I am a postdoc at OSU, and I also am a proud comrade of the Red Nation, and more specifically, our Great Lakes Freedom Council. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit at the end about what the Red Nation is. But in the meantime, we are here to talk about police as a tool of colonialism. And I want to start out with kind of contextualizing this a little bit. So I grew up in Minneapolis. I spent the first 6 years of my life living on the south side of the city. Moved out to the suburbs originally, but I've had a long history of family living in South Minneapolis, proud alumni of South High School. And growing up, I passed by a place called Cup Foods quite often down on 38th and Chicago in the middle of South Minneapolis. And when I was a little kid, the name amused me to no end because I thought it was a really cute name and I was really highly amused as a child. That innocent feeling related to that tiny corner store on the intersection of 38th and Chicago is no more. Because of course, as you probably know, Cup Foods was the site where George Floyd was brutally murdered by Minneapolis Police Department officers in the summer of 2020, which touched off a series of protests and resistance against the police in Minneapolis, and also touched off similar protests nationwide, which is part of this long arc of resistance against police brutality against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And so as a geographer, I'm always really aware of space. That's part of what our discipline is and what we talk about. And now, as a result of what happened at Cup Foods, now that is a space of turmoil to me and a space of realization about the ways that policing in what we call the settler colonial state is made to keep non-white populations down. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what exactly I mean about this, but I'm also aware that this may be the first time that some of you in the audience are hearing about the term settler colonialism. So I want to turn our attention to that term for a moment. Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that is built upon the settlement and enduring occupation of land by colonizing power at the expense of indigenous presence upon the land. So let me take a step back for a second and break down that definition. So in traditional resource extractive colonialism, which is already kind of a bit of a fraught definition, the idea is that the colonizing power comes into a space and extracts resources, builds the economy around the extraction of resources, but doesn't build any serious lasting infrastructure in the place, because in their minds, this is a space that is simply meant to provide resources to the metropolitan power and nothing more. What happens in settler colonialism is that people come to stay. So in the context of the United States and Canada, Anglo settlers and French settlers came to North America, and they were obviously driven by resource extraction, of course, but they also were driven by carving out spaces for inhabitants and building up structures of villages and cities that were meant to endure into the future. The late Patrick Wolfe described settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. And what he means by that is that settler colonialism is a series of structures that are meant to endure and meant to enshrine settler presence upon the land. There is no one event that consists of colonialism. It is a series of events and a series of actions that are taken to build the settler colonial state and to endure it into the future. And there has to be a driving force behind this occupation of land. And how settler colonialism does it is it relies on this myth of terra nullius to proceed. Terra nullius is a Latin term that stands for nobody's land. And how terra nullius fits into the settler colonial project is that the settler colonial state, its history and its contemporary creation story is built upon this idea that the land was empty. The picture on the right is the famous picture of Manifest Destiny. And what that was the overarching idea that the United States had this God-given obligation to spread civilization from the eastern seaboard across the continent, across the Rocky Mountains to the West Coast eventually, and to claim dominion over that land. A similar structure existed in Canada that maybe wasn't exactly Manifest Destiny, but it was still the same idea. And the idea was that the land needed to be made productive use of. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that Indigenous people had deep and lasting political confederations and political structures and structures of land tenure and use of land in the North American continent before colonization. But that wasn't useful for the settler colonial myth of empty land. And so the myth comes up with this idea that, well, Indigenous people are so bad at using the land productively that it might as well be empty and unused. And if they're not going to make productive use of it, we are. And with that, the American settler state began to establish itself. So if we take a look at this map for a second, there's probably nothing spectacular or really interesting about this map, right? It's a map of the United States of America, the 50 states. But for Indigenous people and for our allies that understand the long-lasting and enduring relationships that we have with the land, things tend to look a little bit different. This is a screen grab that I took off of a really awesome site called native-map.ca, which is an ongoing project done by Indigenous people to show the continuing relationships and the historical relationships that Indigenous people have had with much of the land that consists of the Americas. Of course, I focused on the United States here, but if you were to go to this website, and I highly recommend that you do so, you'll be able to find, Indigenous or First Nations in Canada and their historical and contemporary extent of their land. You can also find land in South America and Central America as well. And as you can see, this was not empty land. This was not unused land. These were a wide variety of different tribal nations that were making use of the land and being in communication and in confederation with each other and building relationships. Of course, with the pressures of settler colonialism in the United States, tribal land tends to look more like this nowadays. This is a map based on the 2000 census of Native American or American Indian and Alaska Native land in the United States. And as you can see, it looks very different, right? From here to here. I don't mean this to say that there is not Indigenous presences outside of the reservation. That would be extremely irresponsible and a flat out lie for me to say this. Of course, I grew up in Minneapolis off the reservation, and because of the processes of relocation and termination and the economic conditions that have often fallen upon reservations, you have very, very, very spread out and very notable urban communities of natives. For example, here I'm talking to you from Miami and Shawnee land here in Ohio, and while the Miami and Shawnee don't have contemporary reservations in Ohio, they still have relationships with the land in Ohio, but also Cleveland and Columbus have very robust populations of Native people. The same with Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Oakland, the Bay Area, Albuquerque. I could go on for minutes about the different communities, but there is this kind of divide that is placed through these processes of people that live on reservations and people that live off reservations. But I want to caution us as we go through this to not to think about that as an artificial divide that is really based on colonial ideas and doesn't really speak to the relationships that we have that transcend these colonial boundaries. So as a result of settler colonialism, we have the destruction of Indigenous identity. And so there is this policy of assimilation in the American settler states. And the idea was that these savage Indigenous people were to be brought into this modern civilized European American settler society. Whether they really wanted to or not, the idea was put that, well, this settler way of being is the future. Indigenous identity is something that's in the past and something that we need to put behind us if we are going to grow this great nation. So it's only natural and it's only appropriate that these wild Indians are made to be turned into model American citizens. This sounds genteel, but it was absolutely anything but. I took this picture on the right here is an example of several Native American Indigenous boys that were brought into a boarding school, and they were posed for these pictures of a before and after, and this was supposed to demonstrate the civilizing effect of boarding schools. I think if you talk to people that are familiar with the process, boarding schools were a huge source of trauma. They were, Indigenous language was discouraged, Indigenous culture was discouraged, religion was discouraged in favor of Judeo-Christian values. And civilization in this case didn't mean, of course, full participation in the American political state. Really what it meant was training for manual labor so that they could serve roles that were subservient to white settlers. We also talk about destruction of the land when we talk about the destructive effects of settler colonialism. Overhunting and the destruction of animals and plants that were important to Indigenous peoples was central to the idea of the spread of the settler colonial state. And in fact, in a lot of cases, it was intentional. The idea was that if we, and when I say we, I'm thinking from the viewpoint of the settler state, if we overhunt animals like bison and make it so that tribes that were traditionally more nomadic and moved with hunting seasons and with different seasons, if we can bound them to the spatially based agricultural practices, then they will become more civilized and they'll see that the American settler way is best. Another example, and I talk about this whenever I talk about Indigenous kind of environmental activism, which is something that I'm deeply interested in teaching. One example here that I picture here is the signing over of land as part of the Pick Sloan project in the Dakotas and in the Great Plains in the 1930s and the 1940s, where Indigenous territories were flooded in the name of flood control and irrigation so that settler farms could prosper. And of course, is kind of in the forefront of consciousness here in America today, energy production initiatives such as resource extraction, pipelines, these are ways that Indigenous land is destroyed as well. And a little bit closer to where I want to go is settler colonial violence. And so settler colonial violence is, I define it as a technique of power and hegemony. And so what that really means is that these are ways that the settler colonial state can impose its will upon Indigenous people. And it really underpins the entirety of relations between indigenous nations and the settler colonial state. You will hear a lot of song and dance. This kind of is really common in Canada about reconciliation and the idea that, we're being peaceful and we really want to have good relationships with indigenous nations or First Nations or Native Americans. But to be quite frank with you, since colonization, there's been nothing but a unending series of violences that have been visited upon indigenous people. And how I kind of divide this kind of violence up is spectacular violence, which is armed violence, surveillance, violence that is meant to be seen and is meant to project power, that is unmistakable, that this is a settler colonial state flexing and saying, you need to behave and you need to do what's good for you or we'll make you do so. But also there's quotidian violence, and quotidian, a synonym for that is the everyday. And this quotidian everyday violence is based around the erosion of tribal sovereignty and this idea of recognition. In recent years, there's really been a lot of academic scholarship done by Indigenous people, especially in the Canadian context, about these politics of recognition and how at first blush they are politics that are meant to show that, well, the settler state understands and we recognize that we have an Indigenous presence. But really what it ends up doing is it just kind of dilutes Indigenous presence, and it says, well, we're paying attention, we're giving lip service to your presence and to your sovereignty, and isn't that good enough for you? And so I'm going to return to kind of the spectacular versus quotidian kind of divide here in this talk, but I wanted to present it very early on. And so we come to this kind of evolution of the way that settler colonial policing has happened. In the settler colonial state, if there is a need to flex your power on Indigenous people, it's going to happen through policing. It's going to happen through this practice of letting Indigenous people know that, hey, we're keeping an eye on you, and if you do something that threatens us or threatens settler civilians or threatens a state, we are going to act upon you with disproportionate force to keep you in your place. And so in the early United States, in the early period of colonization, oftentimes militia and civilian vigilante groups often kind of served as this first line of contact between settlers and Indigenous peoples. We see this a lot with some of the wars in New England in the 1600s, where colonial militias were formed of villagers and inhabitants of settler cities and villages and towns in order to fight off Indigenous people in various conflicts that they have. Now, of course, there were often policies in place that were meant to protect Indigenous people from these irregular forms of policing, of course, because the idea was that European colonists viewed themselves as being civilized, and they understood that, well, we're going to give lip service to this idea that we really just want to have good relations with the natives, and we don't really want to kill them or to push them off their land, but we'll do so if we need to. And so these policies were very rarely heeded. For example, one of the biggest policies in British North America in the 13 colonies was a proclamation of 1763, which said, there is this imaginary line running down the Appalachian Mountains, and settlers are not allowed to cross this territory because we want to recognize Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land that's on the other side of this line. Of course, the settlers did what settlers do best and didn't listen to that proclamation, so that led to further conflicts with Indigenous people that extended both before the formation of the United States and even extended beyond the formation of the United States. And while we see a move towards more formalized structures of policing in the 19th century, state militias and really these irregular forms of defense are still in this time period increasing used in some cases in the 19th century increasingly in order to keep Indigenous peoples at bay, especially when you start seeing friction between Indigenous people and settlers surrounding increasing marginalization of Indigenous peoples land-wise, or the breaking of treaty promises by the United States government. But these irregular forms of policing, especially vigilante violence, continue. The picture on the right here is actually a ad from, I believe, the 1860s in my home state of Minnesota, where basically the idea is this was likely after the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, which was that if you kill a Native person, if you find them in Minnesota, because by this point the Dakota had been pushed out of Minnesota to what we now know is North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and the Ojibwe were kind of held in check in the northern part of the state. But if you found a Native person and you killed them, you would get $200 as a reward. So needless to say, kind of hunting Native people almost for sport and for profit became a way of kind of policing and a way of reinforcing this control over land. And it's a really interesting kind of relationship, because even though in these kind of cases of kind of more settler driven, not state driven policing, you see settlers really at the forefront. You also kind of see a weird synergy between the state and individual settlers. So the state, can portray itself as saying, well, hey, these are individual actors acting out. This isn't us doing this, right? We didn't create these mobs that got together and drove people out of their land, such as in the Trail of Tears in the South, but they also were always nearby to make sure that Indigenous people didn't retaliate. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from Patrick Wolf's article, The Elimination of the Native. And this is a narrative by a soldier who was standing kind of nearby and observed settler mobs driving Cherokee people out of their homes. Families at dinner were startled by the sudden gleam of bayonets in the doorway and rose up to be driven with blows and oaths along the weary miles of trail that led to the stockade, where they were held prior to the removal itself. Men were seized in their fields or going along the road, women were taken from their wheels, and children from their play. In many cases, on turning for one last look as they crossed a ridge, they saw their homes in flames, fired by the lawless rabble that followed on the heels of the soldiers to loot and pillage. So keen were these outlaws on the scent that in some instances they were driving off the cattle and other stock of the Indians almost before the soldiers had fairly started their owners in the other direction. Systematic hunts were made by these same men for Indian graves to rob them of the silver pendants and other valuables deposited with the dead. A Georgia volunteer, who was afterward a colonel in the Confederate service, said, "I fought through the Civil War and I've seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." And so you see this really deadly cooperation between individual settlers in the state. The soldiers drive the Cherokee out, and then the settlers come in and basically pillage and loot their belongings. And while the soldiers, might have said, well, this is for your protection to the Cherokee, well, we all know that if the Cherokee would have turned around and fought back, that the soldiers would have put any kind of rebellion down on the settlers' behalf. This is another key example. So I always like using this when I talk in Canada, is because the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the Mounties, is probably one of the most enduring symbols of Canada. They're often kind of viewed in this idea of being polite and being protective, but being benevolent. And the actual history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to say nothing of the violence that they do to the present day, would really shatters that myth for a lot of people. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the Mounties, were founded in the late 19th century in what was then called the Northwest Territories of Canada, which is different than the contemporary Northwest Territories. But they were formed as a way to extend British and Canadian power and force projection to First Nation villages in the Northwest Territories after a series of Indigenous rebellions. And they were essentially a way of saying, we're keeping an eye on you, and if you dare to rise up against us again, we will put you down with overwhelming force. It was a way of deterring any kind of rebellion or any kind of misconduct by Indigenous people before it started. But people oftentimes are not really aware of that history. And of course, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as we'll talk about in a little bit here, also has kind of its fraught relationship with First Nations in contemporary times. So let's turn our attention back south of the US-Canadian border and all the way to the other side of the country. The Texas Rangers, probably the most common way that people have heard of the Texas Rangers is through the television show Walker, Texas Ranger, or the baseball team, the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers are a real law enforcement agency in the state of Texas, and they were founded during the Texan War of Independence. And they served as a early form of law enforcement in the Republic of Texas and in the state of Texas after it joined the United States. But one of their chief tasks was to help protect white Texans against Comanche and Kiowa and other indigenous peoples who Texan settlers came into conflict with in the mid-19th century. So the Texas Rangers have their genesis in kind of making sure that indigenous people stayed in their place as well. So we really talk about kind of this force projection and in vigilante violence and kind of this more state-sanctioned violence. But we start to see in the early 20th century kind of a move towards a different form of policing and a different way of policing indigenous peoples. One of the kind of most widespread ways of doing this was through Public Law 280. And what Public Law 280 was, it was a 1953 federal law that transferred criminal and civil jurisdiction over Native people on reservations to states. So in places where states don't have civil or criminal jurisdiction, technically the tribes and the federal government have jurisdiction over crimes. So for example, one notable example is in the Red Lake Nation in northwestern Minnesota. It's a closed reservation and the tribe has almost virtually complete sovereignty over its territory. So if a crime gets committed in a major enough crime that's beyond the capability of the tribal police to investigate, they have to bring the FBI onto the reservation to do an investigation. And this is kind of largely in various forms how it looked for all Native nations in the United States before 1953. But when this law went into effect, these states such as Alaska, California, virtually all reservations in Minnesota besides the Bois Forte Band or Bois Forte Reservation and the Red Lake Reservation, Nebraska, nearly all reservations in Oregon besides the Warm Springs Nation, and nearly all reservations in Wisconsin besides the Menominee Reservation. These reservations that were in these states now had to deal with the fact that the state and counties and kind of state level jurisdictions could enforce laws on Native people. And this meant that it could lead to different controversies, for example, law enforcement agencies that didn't have experience working with tribal nations enforcing laws, or in some cases, controversies over the tribal right to their own law enforcement. So the picture on the right here is the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe's tribal police force. And there was a controversy a few years ago where the local county where the Mille Lacs Band was, their sheriff department canceled an agreement to allow the Mille Lacs tribal police to enforce a law on their own reservation. And what this meant is that this police force now basically couldn't do anything. They couldn't make arrests. They couldn't protect tribal members. They couldn't enforce tribal law. But also the local sheriff really didn't devote a lot of resources to kind of fill in that gap. So essentially it allowed crime to increase on the reservation and allowed drug trafficking to come in. And luckily this was resolved, but this is just an example of kind of the weird relationships and the weird kind of gaps that can be opened up by these jurisdictions and the way that these shift with laws such as Public Law 280. So I want to turn my focus now to kind of the different forms of racism that can come versus urban policing and rural policing. So The racism of policing in urban areas and rural areas, although there's a lot that is similar, there are some key differences between the ways that this happens. In urban areas, there is often a higher rate of arrest and incarceration of Indigenous and Black individuals. For example, in my own county, Hennepin County, Minnesota, from 2015 to 2019, 4.3% of all arrests were of Indigenous individuals, and 56.7% were of Black individuals. And so I did a little more digging, and I was like, well, what percentage of the overall county population? And Hennepin County has well over 1 million people. You know, what percentage of the county population do these groups kind of consist of? And Indigenous people only make up 1.1% of the population of Hennepin County, and Black people only make up 13.8%. So there's these kind of orders of magnitude where Indigenous and Black people are being arrested at rates that are disproportionate to their overall makeup of Hennepin County, and more specifically Minneapolis. And there's mistreatment that goes on in county jails, and there's police brutality that happens. Of course, George Floyd is just another sad episode in kind of this long history, especially in Minneapolis, of police brutality. But it doesn't just happen in Minneapolis. Most notably, over the last few years, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan has kind of found itself in the news for all the wrong reasons because of what they called Starlight Tours. And these Starlight Tours began in about 1976. And from what I've heard, they've kind of ended over the last few years, except there's no way that I trust that these things have ended, of course. They just are learning to probably hide it better. And what these Starlight Tours were, it sounds like a really kind of positive name. It was anything but positive. What happened is that Indigenous people, First Nations people in Saskatoon were picked up on the pretense of being drunk or disorderly. And what the police did is that they took them out to the rural outskirts of Saskatoon in the middle of the night, usually in winter, and they just dropped them off. They dropped them off without any warm clothes, or dropped them off and kind of forced them to basically make their way back into the city. And this kind of became really widespread in the Canadian media when there were a series of deaths that were officially attributed to the practice. So they say that there were 3 official deaths. There's more than likely far more deaths that happened that just aren't being reported. But this was a widespread practice that was being done by the police to Indigenous people. So I want to talk a little bit about rural policing and the relationship that Indigenous people and police have in what we call border towns, or towns that are right off of the reservation that are often majority white towns, is often really fraught. And so I'll tell a series of anecdotes here, because this is something that kind of touches more personally to me. When I was a kid, we would go up north to Cass Lake, Minnesota, population 860, which is the center of our reservation. But the nearest big towns to that are places such as Bemidji, Minnesota, Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Probably maybe only a few people have heard of these places. But these are major towns where you go to get shopping done or do anything that you can't do in Cass Lake. And I remember going with my cousins into Grand Rapids, which is an hour away, and us hanging out outside of Target, and the local police coming by and basically asking my cousins, hey, is it dress up like a gangster day today? They didn't say anything to me because I was like 8 or 9 years old, but they said that to my cousin, and it was just something that's always stuck with me. But there's always kind of this weird tension that exists in these border towns, where police are more than ready to arrest Indigenous people for the slightest provocation and throw them in jail. Of course, as I just talked about with Mille Lacs, there's often these repeated attempts by county officials to infringe upon tribal jurisdiction when it comes to enforcing laws on their own reservation. And of course, just like in urban areas, there's higher incarceration rates of Indigenous people in rural jails. The picture to the right here is the Cass County courthouse, where this is the county that Cass Lake and most of the Leech Lake Nation is located within. And a friend of mine told me stories about the sheriff would pick people up in Cass Lake and bring them down to the courthouse, and they would process them and put them in jail for, a few hours. And then they would just let them go. They would just be like, okay, well, you can leave now. And this would happen year round. This would happen in the middle of the winter, and they would just kick them out and say, well, you got to find your own way back to Cass Lake. Similar to these kind of Starlight tours that happened up in Saskatoon, where they just kind of left them to their own defenses. But there's also a lot of brutality and a lot of mistreatment that goes on in these jails. And it's really kind of funny that I talk about this today, because one of my cousins is who's a Leech Lake tribal member, he's in jail in Minnesota right now on some kind of charges that are a little kind of hard to prove. And he's been in jail for a few months, and they won't tell him when his court date is. They he keeps trying to get a bail hearing, and they won't give him a bail hearing. He was just complaining to me today about, I got attacked and I broke my arm, and they won't give me any physical therapy or any kind of medical service. And he talks about how the jailers are just mistreat him all the time because he's Native, and to them, he's just another drunk Indian rather than a human being. And so, it's really tough, when there's kind of this racist policing that goes on, and this racist kind of enforcement of laws on Indigenous people, and kind of this racist treatment of them in jail. And so it's just really kind of tough. These are kind of one of the things where it just shouldn't have to be that way. And why is it that the state feels the need to do this? And so one of the ways that I argue that this happens is because a lot of Indigenous resistance is viewed in kind of these spectacular frameworks by the settler state and by settler law enforcement. So kind of returning to what I was talking about, where there's these spectacular forms of resistance and there's these everyday quotidian forms of resistance. Spectacular forms of Indigenous resistance are actions that are meant to be seen and heard. They are performative, and I mean performative in the way that they are meant to really enact something and really do something, not performative that often gets thrown around on places like Native Twitter, where they're just acting out to be seen. No, they're still trying to do something. They're performing an action, but these actions are meant to be big, and they're meant to be seen. And these actions are perceived as direct, aggressive challenges to the settler colonial state by settler society. And so you'll kind of notice that I've kind of taken a bit of a broad interpretation of policing. So I'm not just talking about the police departments and sheriffs, but I've also talked about military subjugation. And that is because, policing, in my mind, it doesn't just mean subjugation by the police. What it really means to me is this way of enforcing laws and enforcing good behavior by populations of people, in this case, Indigenous people. And by good behavior, I mean behavior that's not threatening to the settler state. And so when we take a look at, notable cases of spectacular Indigenous activism over the last 50 years, we kind of see that when they've happened, the settler state kind of feels the need to really crack down on it. The occupation of Alcatraz is often, and the increasing organizing among Indigenous communities in the U.S., such as Minneapolis and Bay Area, in the 1960s is kind of this kickoff of what we kind of view as an upswelling of Indigenous activism in the United States. I argue that Indigenous activism never really went away, but this is the point where it really started to seep into the public consciousness. And this kind of culminates in the 1973 occupation by the American Indian movement of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And while there's nuances to this, of course, the settler state cracked down upon this occupation with heavy American military and a police response. And I talk about nuances, of course, because they were coming to the defense of a very problematic Lakota leader who was essentially ruling his reservation with an iron fist, and the American Indian movement was kind of counteracting that. So this was a case where they were really coming to defend an Indigenous nation, in the letter of their actions, but really what it was, this Indigenous person is doing things that we want them to do. These protesters are doing things that we don't want them to do. So we're going to crack down upon them, even though, there is this problematic person right here. We look at what happened up in Mohawk lands, up in Kanawaka or Oka in the 1990s, and in 1990, which centered around the proposed construction of a golf course on disputed Mohawk lands. There was a blockade led by Mohawk people, and in this case, it was deemed that, well, the police aren't going to be able to handle this. So in this case, the policing fell to the Canadian military. That led to a confrontation. There were a lot of really stark photographs that came out of this, such as the one to the right, and of course. This golf course eventually got canceled, but this was a very sharp confrontation that was centered around Mohawk people not doing what the settler state wanted them to do, so taking police actions in order to kind of subjugate them. And of course, we take a look, probably one of the most notable examples of this were the protests surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline. Of course, this really, a lot of people are familiar with this, but to anybody who isn't, the Dakota Access Pipeline was a pipeline that ran through Standing Rock treaty lands, that it represented a threat to drinking water as well as burial grounds and other important cultural sites. And so what happened is that the Standing Rock Nation and tribal allies kind of formed these camps and did actions that were meant to protest and push back against the construction of this pipeline. It sparked these acts of protest and solidarity outside of Standing Rock as well. But there was an extremely violent, in this case, police response by the state. State police from North Dakota and other states came to Standing Rock. I remember I was still living in Minnesota at the time, and the controversy that was kind of surrounding us at home was that a number of sheriffs in Minnesota decided that they were going to send officers and deputies up to Standing Rock as well to kind of help with these actions to break up blockades and break up the protesters. But it was this kind of this massive response where it's like, we need to get a lot of law enforcement up there in order to dislodge these Indian protesters, which is extremely problematic and just kind of led to just these acts of violence against Native people that really are just trying to advocate for the right to, clean water into undesecrated cultural grounds. One of my absolute kind of favorite examples to talk about of Indigenous resistance and the ways that the settler state kind of pushes back against that was what's been going on up in Wet'suwet'en territories near the coast of British Columbia. And the Unistoten camp right here is a picture of a checkpoint in Unistoten territory. And just kind of as a background of this, what this was that the Unistoten camp was a camp that has been created by the traditional chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation as a response to kind of this planned construction of pipelines and energy projects that did not and do not, or at least until recently, did not have consent by traditional hereditary Wet'suwet'en leaders to enter and cross unceded Wet'suwet'en lands. The pipeline in question, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, had gotten consent from a vast majority of First Nations governments, but the hereditary Wet'suwet'en chief said, you haven't consulted us and you haven't satisfied our concerns, so we don't give you consent to cross this land. And so what they did is they formed this Unistoten camp as a way to kind of get a return to traditional uses of the land and ways of living and being with the land. And this is really important because the camp is very explicit about their purpose. And they say, this isn't a protest or a demonstration. What we're doing is we're occupying and we're using our traditional territory as we have for centuries. And that's all we're doing. It just so happens that, of course, we're blocking the pipeline construction, but you didn't have our consent to cross this land anyways. And, in order to really be good stewards of the land, we're going to occupy it and we're going to make sure that it's not damaged. Of course, to our old friends, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, this was unacceptable. This is a picture of one of the hereditary chiefs being led away by RCMP officers during actions earlier this year. And so this is really key, because this shows that, you know, even when you have these leaders that are speaking and that are really at the head of these movements and are being peaceful about these kinds of things, and they're not protesting, the police doesn't give a damn, right? They still view this as, well, you're blocking this pipeline, you're blocking these modes of capitalism, and we're going to remove you by force if need be. And so again, I want to return to kind of why does this happen? And I think that one of the ways and one of the reasons why this happens is that we talk about Indigenous identity as being formed by resistance. And what I mean by that is there's this misconception that resistance drives Indigenous identity. And I say that this is a damage-based perspective. This furthers a trope that Indigenous people are inherently violent, and it justifies repression and continued oppression. And really, it justifies these increasingly oppressive policing measures in the name of pacification. So, if settler society views Indigenous people as inherently violent and as inherently dedicated to the violent overthrow of the settler colonial state, which, you know, in some cases they're probably right, but in a lot of cases, you know, things like what was going on in Unistoten territory, these are just people doing the things that their ancestors have taught them to do, and it's still worthy of being violently and brutally subjugated. And so, you know, the Wet'suwet'en camp, or Unistoten camp, in my mind, is this idea of quotidian Indigenous resistance. And what this means is everyday acts of resistance that are based in cultural teachings, political sovereignty, and understanding of history. But these are still direct, aggressive challenges to the settler colonial state. These are still saying that, hey, our histories and our cultures and our presences upon this land are not up for debate, and they're not up for elimination. We're going to do the things that we've been taught to do in order to continue these things. And the settler colonial state sometimes has a bit of trouble dealing with that. But like I said, the problem is that usually when they have trouble dealing with something, they immediately go to, I know, let's go ahead and shut it down using violence. And so, you know, that's still kind of a bit of a downside about this kind of resistance, is it still is subject to these forms of policing by the settler colonial state. So really, I want, when we talk about Indigenous resistance and kind of this face of this policing, I want us to think about it as resistance formed by identity. And this is different than what I talked about before, because the identity is at the center of this resistance. It's not the resistance at the center of identity. And what I mean by this is that to be Indigenous today is to present effective resistance to the settler colonial state. And when we as Indigenous people and Indigenous allies resist settler colonialism, more often than not, we're doing it by performing the actions that our ancestors would have done. And through this paradigm, I argue that settler colonialism will continue to be a failed project in the aim of completely eliminating Indigenous presence upon the land. And this leads us to really start to contemplate the possibilities of what might be. And, you know, so normally we would start talking about abolition and defunding the police and what this might look like. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of the talk tonight, I think that when we think about these kinds of forms of resistance, it makes it possible for us to take a look at these alternative futures where, you know, police brutality and racist policing are not facts of life, but are instead replaced with ways of uplifting people and addressing really the real problems that are going on, such as poverty and other societal issues that are caused by capitalism. So that is the end of our talk here. It's a bit of an abrupt end, but I really want to leave you with this question and hope that I've stimulated some thought about, you know, what are the possibilities that come up in your mind about this? And so I want to turn our attention to a couple of quick things here that I want to make sure that I talk about tonight. And the first thing is that we're dealing with kind of this idea of uneven policing right now up in Mi'kmaq, in Mi'kmaq territories up in Nova Scotia. Mi'kmaq fishermen are dealing with blatant racism by white settlers who are upset about treaty rights related to lobster fishing, and they're dealing with a lot of violence and destruction of property. And in a lot of cases, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has stood by. And so I would urge you to take a look at this really, and I almost regret the word situation, because really what this is just another long example of brutal subjugation of Indigenous rights to make a livelihood for themselves. And so if you want to take a screenshot of this, I bring this up because I've decided that my honorarium for this talk that was graciously offered to me, I've already designated that I want it donated to causes that are related to Mi'kmaq people, so that they can support themselves in the face of the settler colonial violence. So here's a link and some information that you can use in order to transfer money to them in order to help support them in their time of need. I also want to bring up that if you're interested in learning more about the Red Nation, the Red Nation we are an organization of indigenous, of radical indigenous socialists and comrades that are really working towards decolonization and towards really bringing about a better future for our comrades across Turtle Island, but also our comrades in occupied Palestine and in other places where colonialism seeks to disrupt and dislodge and eliminate indigenous people and indigenous presences. So if you're interested in learning more about what we do in the Red Nation, or perhaps you're interested in maybe starting the path to becoming a member, you can learn more about us at the website therednation.org. We also have a very awesome Twitter account, which is at @the_red_nation. For people here, and when I say here, of course, in a world of Zoom, for people at Michigan State University, you would fall under the Great Lakes Freedom Council. And we have an active Facebook page that you can contact us there. We also have an Instagram at the Red Nation Great Lakes, which I happen to be the person that runs the Instagram. And we also post information on there about cool events that we're doing and ways that you can get involved. And so if you want to learn more, you can go to those places. I'm also happy to take questions here at the end of the talk tonight. And so with that, Miigwech Gigawabamin, which means thank you and talk to you soon. If you have any questions that you think of that that I don't get to tonight, or that you think of it after the fact, like which often happens to me, here's my contact information at the bottom. You can reach me at my email address. If you want to follow me on Twitter as well, you can do so at Deondre Smiles. So awesome. Thank you very much.
Just before questions, I just wanted to quickly add that if anybody is interested, there will be another zine coming out in that matches this talk, and it does actually have the information about those that lobster trapping conflict that's going on. We also designed these little beading packets to kind of show the solidarity between Native resistance and Palestinian resistance, designed by our own e-board member, Andrew, amazing, talented. And so if you would like to get one, there's 4 designs. You can see them all on our Facebook page in the discussion for this event. There's a survey that I will throw into the chat in a moment. And please make sure you fill out all the information, because I think 5 people filled it out and did not give us any information of how to send it to them. So please fill it out so that we can contact you and everything and get it to you. And I will also put information about our Facebook page, our Instagram and Twitter and things if you guys want to get connected. And if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead at this time. I know we're going over a little, but you can put it in the chat or unmute if you want.
I'll ask a question. Hi, Deondre. It's nice to see you. Thank you so much for the really good background on a lot of these issues. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about. So you started the presentation by talking about some of the movements that are going on right now, centered on Black Lives Matter um, and a lot of the fight going on for that for police violence against Black people. And I was wondering if you have thoughts on how Native folks can work together with Black folks on seeing like commonalities as well as differences in ways that don't necessarily like take away from specificity, but like that are working to bring us all together. So I was just curious if you have any. I'd love to hear any thoughts on that.
No, thank you, Kai. That's a really great question. And I think that's been something that I know in Minneapolis, especially, there's been kind of a lot of conversation and sometimes tensions about that. I think that early on, that there were questions, when Native people turned out for, kind of our Black comrades in Minneapolis, but, there was tensions around, well, are we just co-opting kind of their voices, and are we centering ourselves? And I think that really the best way that I would recommend that going about this is just, really coming together and having conversations and really listening to one another. And, and I think that, through these conversations and through listening and through kind of finding those commonalities, that's where one way that you're going to find ways to work together, but also recognizing that there's very unique kind of pressures and unique situations that each group faces, and understanding that there are those differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, that's necessarily a bad thing. That's just, that can be ways of kind of understanding, maybe looking at alternative ways of kind of working through these issues. And one thing that, I would say for kind of for Native comrades that want to do that work is maybe kind of sometimes taking a step back and kind of recognizing that at a moment like this, sometimes we might be doing our work towards decolonization by kind of allowing Black people to kind of take the lead in some of these movements, because I know that, in other cases, Black people have been happy to allow Native people to kind of take the lead in issues that maybe are more salient to Native people, but also have that kind of overlap. So it's just, yeah, it really just boils down to just kind of talking with one another and being willing to really truly listen to one another and know when to hold space, so that, these voices can really come to the fore and take precedence.
Anyone else have any other questions?
I feel like this is a time when it's like the end of class, and like I'm the teacher and I'm staring at the students and they're staring back at me and they're just like, we just want to go to bed.
Well, if you all want to go to bed, we will be posting this recording to our brand new YouTube channel. So please revisit it. Thank you again so much, Deondre, for your wise words. And keep an eye on the event page for the zine if you want more information and resources about this topic. Thank you all so much.
Yes. Miigwech, everyone, for your attention and for the words of thank you and gratitude. It's really, it means a lot to me.
Yes, thank you everyone for tuning in tonight.
Thank you.
Deondre, do you mind sending me this recording over email?
Yeah, I can definitely do so. Here, let me stop it.